Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. This is going to be a follow-up video to my previous video on vitamin D and mushrooms, and really I wanted to address some of the questions that I had regarding that video. And in particular, a lot of people have asked me, could you use mushrooms as a source of vitamin D instead of taking supplements? If you don't want to watch the rest of this video and you just want a quick answer, the answer to that is yes, you could, and that will save you listening to me talking for the next 20 minutes or so. But for those people that want a more in-depth answer, I'm going to go into the science of it. I had a look through the literature. I've found some figures. I've done some calculations. I'm going to give you a rough back of the fag packet estimate of how much vitamin D you could actually obtain from irradiating mushrooms with ultraviolet light, and what's the best way to do it and how do you practically achieve that. So really this video is going to be how to make your own vitamin D from mushrooms. Now to start this video, I just want to say that I still think supplements are the best way to get your vitamin D. Now, the reason that I think that supplements are the best way to get your vitamin D is that you know how much is in each tablet, and therefore you can tailor your dose for your body weight, for your requirements, and it makes it much easier to calculate the amount of vitamin D that you take. There is a caveat with taking vitamin D from your diet if you take it from food, and that is it's very difficult to actually estimate the amount of vitamin D that you have every day, and therefore if you're taking large amounts of vitamin D, the risk of toxicity, and there is a risk of toxicity from vitamin D, that risk of toxicity becomes it becomes more apparent. There is a higher risk there, simply because you don't know how much vitamin D is in the mushroom. So that's the caveat to this. That's what I wanted to make absolutely clear before I give you this information. You do have to be careful. Vitamin D can become toxic if you take too much, and therefore you need to know what you're doing. And this is why I would always recommend that if you want to take vitamin D as a let's say a supplement, whether that's from irradiated mushrooms or from tablets, tablets are, in my opinion, the safest way to do that. Having said that, I have always said in my videos that you should try and get the vitamin D and other vitamins as much as you can from your food, and then a supplement is really something you take on top of that. So bearing all this in mind, could you use mushrooms as a source of vitamin D? Well, the best way to actually show that it's possible to reverse a vitamin D deficiency by taking irradiated mushrooms is to show a case study, and I found one in the literature. Before I'll bring up the details of that case study, I just want to quickly, for those people that maybe haven't watched my last video, I just want to quickly go over why vitamin D is present in mushrooms. Mushrooms contain a compound called ergosterol. It's a compound that is structurally similar to cholesterol. We have cholesterol in our body cells. Mushrooms have this compound called ergosterol. Now, in human skin, when we expose it to ultraviolet light, there is a reaction that occurs, and that cholesterol that we have in our cells is able to be converted into vitamin D3, which is called cholecalciferol. That vitamin D3 is then sent to the liver. It's hydroxylated, and that 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D3 that results from that reaction is what we measure in our plasma as our vitamin D levels. That's the accepted biological marker for vitamin D. It can subsequently be hydroxylated again in the kidney, and it becomes 1,2,5-dihydroxy vitamin D3, and then it goes through a process of reactions before it's excreted. Mushrooms can undergo a very similar process. When you expose a mushroom to ultraviolet light, the ergosterol is converted into a compound called ergocalciferol, which is vitamin D2, and that when we eat the mushrooms, that ergocalciferol can actually be hydroxylated in the liver in the same way as our cholecalciferol, and that becomes then 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D2. It's a very similar compound. It doesn't have quite the same biological activity. there is a more rapid excretion of the ergocalciferol version of vitamin D. It's slightly less biologically active, so therefore you need slightly more of it. So that's another caveat to this video. The vitamin D concentrations that I'm talking about, if they're relating to mushrooms that ergocalciferol, they're not a direct comparison to vitamin D3 that you would get in supplements. There is a conversion that you can do, but it's not really fully understood how much ergocalciferol relates to how much cholecalciferol, but it's less. There's a more rapid excretion of it from the body, and therefore it's not quite so biologically active. It's not a big difference, maybe 75-80% of the activity of cholecalciferol, maybe a little bit more, and it will obviously depend on your own biochemistry as to how quickly you excrete it. But generally it's not as biologically active, and therefore you need slightly more ergocalciferol in your diet than you would if you were consuming cholecalciferol. So that's another caveat to the information here. So mushrooms can produce vitamin D, and that reaction, as in humans, if you expose humans to sunlight, we produce more vitamin D. If you expose mushrooms to sunlight, they produce more vitamin D. So it's a very similar process, and then we eat the mushrooms and we get their vitamin D. So that's what the basis of this entire video is about. Now, if we have a look at the case study, I'll bring the case study up and some of the details. There was this was published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was the case of an Indian gentleman that lived in Slough in England, and he was shown to be vitamin D deficient. And if we have a look, his levels of vitamin D, bring those up on the screen. He was a vegetarian. He had religious reasons why he didn't eat certain foods, and he decided that he didn't want to change his diet. He didn't want to take supplements. So what he decided to do was to irradiate his own mushrooms. And if we have a look at the concentrations of his 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D before and after he did that, we can see that his 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D concentration was 17 nanomoles per litre, which is below the normal range for vitamin D, and he managed to get that up to 39 nanomoles per litre through his consumption of irradiated mushrooms. And this has been published in the literature. It is a recorded medical case of this occurring, and this was obviously reported by his doctor. Now, how did he actually do this? What he did was he took his mushrooms, his approximately 200 grams of button mushrooms. He bought an ultraviolet light from a hardware store. He shone the light onto the button mushrooms from approximately 15 centimeters away, and then he stir fried the mushrooms and he ate them. And he did that for that was part of his dietary changes. That he didn't make any other changes to his diet. It was just a supplementary thing he did purely because he realized that he was deficient in vitamin D. So he got his vitamin D into the normal range by consuming irradiated mushrooms. So this is just a case study. I'll put the link to this paper in the comments box below this video, so that if you're interested you can read it. It's just a case study to show that this is and has been recorded in the literature, and therefore this is something to base. This information is based on previous people trying this. Now, there are a lot of studies that have been done on mushrooms and looking at the different ways that you can irradiate them and the various conditions that allow the maximum amount of vitamin D to be produced. And again, I will put some of these, as I talk about them, I'll put some of these papers in the comments box below this video, so that if you're interested, you can have a look at some of the graphs, you can have a look at some of the information. They're not that complex to read, they're quite simple. Most of the studies take mushrooms, they give them, they expose them under different conditions, and then they measure the vitamin D concentration as ergocalciferol in the mushroom tissues. I've talked before about the way that the best way to irradiate mushrooms is on the gills. If you irradiate the cap of the mushroom, there is a lower production of vitamin D than if you irradiate the gills. So if you were going to produce your own vitamin D in mushrooms, you would want to irradiate the gills. However, you want to irradiate both sides of the mushroom. You'll get a certain amount of vitamin D produced from the cap, and a certain amount produced from the gills. More is produced when you irradiate the gills, but obviously if you irradiate both sides, you get the sum of both of the increases. So if I bring up this graph now, we can see that this is from a study that used ultraviolet A radiation, and it irradiated mushrooms with ultraviolet A radiation for a period of time. And they showed that it was about an hour that you need to irradiate the mushrooms for in order to be able to maximally generate the amount of vitamin D. After an hour, there's really no more increase in the amount of ergocalciferol that is produced in the mushrooms. So if you're going to irradiate mushrooms to be able to produce your own vitamin D, you need to do it for about an hour. And as we can see from this graph, if you irradiate the cap, you get an increase. If you irradiate the gills, you get a larger increase. But if you turn the mushrooms over so that you irradiate both sides, you get effectively a larger production of vitamin D. And what I would suggest here is this is me just throwing out an idea. I think if you actually sliced the mushrooms and increased the surface area so that there was more of the actual mushroom exposed to UV light, you would probably maximize the generation of vitamin D. It appears that the mushroom can generate vitamin D from the stalk, from the gills, and from the cap, and therefore it looks like the cells generally, it doesn't matter where the cells are on the mushroom, they seem to be able to generate vitamin D if they get exposed to UV light. Slicing or dicing the mushrooms would therefore increase the surface area of the mushrooms, and therefore I think would maximally generate the vitamin D that was required. Another thing to say is the Indian gentleman in the case study bought an ultraviolet lamp from a hardware store, but we do have access to free ultraviolet light from the sun. And the graph that I just showed you was from a study that used ultraviolet A radiation to irradiate mushrooms, and the sun produced, well, the light that gets to us from the sun is 95% ultraviolet A light. There's about 5% ultraviolet B light, and very small amounts of other ultraviolet light, but it's mostly ultraviolet A light, and therefore exposing mushrooms to the sun would generate, based on the graph that I've just put up, would generate large amounts of vitamin D. Now, the problem that you will have if you try to do this is that if there is enough sun outside to be able to generate vitamin D in mushrooms, there's clearly enough sun to generate vitamin D in your own skin, and therefore it really negates the purpose of doing this. The reason that I could see somebody would want to do this is to be able to maximally generate the vitamin D in the mushrooms and then use them as a supplement when there isn't any ultraviolet light. And so therefore the conclusion that you would have to come to is that once you've done this, you would then have to store the mushrooms. You would have to, if you're going to use the sun, you'd have to irradiate them in the summer. You'd then have to freeze the mushrooms, and then you would have to eat the mushrooms during the winter and get the vitamin D that way. Have looked, and there are a number of studies that have measured vitamin D concentrations in various types of stored mushrooms, such as tinned mushrooms, frozen mushrooms, and compared them with fresh mushrooms. And there is a drop off in vitamin D in foods, as you would expect, and it's not just mushrooms. Generally, foods will lose their nutrient content over time. However, for example, the difference in the vitamin D levels between canned mushrooms and fresh mushrooms, yes, there is a lower amount of vitamin D in canned mushrooms, but the amount is not, it's not a great deal less. So it does appear that you can store mushrooms and then consume them later, and therefore they could be a supplement of vitamin D during the winter. So that's a possibility. You could freeze them, or you could find some other way of storing them. I believe you could dry them and store them dry. In terms of the amount of the type of UV light that maximally creates synthesizes vitamin D in mushrooms, it appears that UVB is the a type of light that maximally stimulates vitamin D production. There's less from UVC and then less still from UVA. But if I bring up this graph now, you can actually see that the amounts that you get are not that much lower, and obviously it depends on there would be so many other factors involved, but yes, you do get less vitamin D synthesis from UVA light, which is the first bar of the three, and you get most from UVB, but it's not a great difference. Another thing you can see from this graph here is that the different types of mushrooms produce different amounts of vitamin D. So selecting oyster mushrooms over button mushrooms, for example, would allow you to generate more vitamin D in the mushrooms. So selecting the type of mushrooms that you want as well is another important factor. There does appear to be a difference, and that might relate to the way the mushroom is constructed, the amount of enzymes that they have in the mushroom. The temperatures have been assessed, and 35 degrees appears to be about the temperature that maximally generates vitamin D, and the moisture content of the mushroom appears to be needs to be about 80% to maximally generate vitamin D. Now, the moisture content of a mushroom normally is about 90 to 92%, something like that. So that's how much water there is in a mushroom. So there's only 8% dry solid mass in a mushroom. 92% of it is water. So a slightly dehydrated mushroom, losing 10% of its water, it maximally generates vitamin D. But I think again the differences will be relatively small. So that's probably something that's not going to make a massive difference. How much vitamin D can you get from a mushroom? Well, again, I had a look around. I did find a study that had been done looking at the vitamin D concentrations of mushrooms, and it was interesting that they measured the vitamin D concentration of various mushrooms, and the mushroom that had the highest amount of vitamin D was actually the ones that had been irradiated. They got the vitamin D, they got those mushrooms with the highest content of vitamin D from a producer that actually irradiated their mushrooms with ultraviolet light to boost the vitamin D concentration of them. And so that's quite interesting. If we take an average amount of vitamin D from a mushroom, let's say after we've there are different amounts, and I've looked around and I've tried to pick an amount that is a kind of a mean value, and I would say an irradiated mushroom, depending on the type, depending on how it's irradiated, may have 50 micrograms per gram of dry mass of vitamin D in it. If we assume that a mushroom is roughly and I'll put the calculation that I've done up now on the screen so you can see roughly what I've done. If we have a look and we say that there's 50 micrograms per gram of dry mass of vitamin D in an irradiated mushroom, we'll say that the water content is around 92%. So that gives us 92 grams of water, which gives us 8 grams of actual mushroom. So therefore, there's going to be about 400 micrograms per 100 grams of vitamin D in an irradiated mushroom. So that's going to give us about 16,000 IU of vitamin D. I wouldn't suggest that people would eat mushrooms every day. People will eat, mushrooms. Let's say you ate mushrooms twice a week. So you're going to be able to get about 4,500 IU of vitamin D per day as a mean intake, consuming if you consumed 100 grams of mushrooms twice a week. So it's not an insignificant amount of vitamin D. 4,000 IU is one of the higher values that you would get from supplements. So yes, the answer to the question is you could use vitamin D from mushrooms as an alternative to taking supplements. It does appear that if you can compare that value I've just calculated From the study that I looked at, where they found the mushrooms and compared the values in different from different producers, the producer that irradiated their mushrooms, the authors measured the vitamin D content as 2,242 IU per 100 grams of mushrooms. So we don't know how they irradiated them, for how long they irradiated them, and we don't know the details, but that is it's a significant amount of vitamin D that would allow you to maintain your vitamin D levels throughout the winter. So there is a reasonable amount of information out there, and I hope this video has gone some way to answering questions about whether you could actually abandon taking supplements, and you could get your vitamin D from mushrooms. If you already eat mushrooms, but they're not irradiated, the actual vitamin D content of non-irradiated mushrooms is virtually zero. Mushrooms only produce vitamin D like we do when they're exposed to UV light. So wild mushrooms tend to have higher concentrations of vitamin D than cultivated mushrooms, because the cultivated mushrooms are not exposed to UV light. Wild mushrooms growing, obviously outside, they tend to be, they have a much higher chance of being exposed to UV light. That will depend on their location, obviously, but this is probably why those studies that have compared wild to cultivated mushrooms find that wild mushrooms have much higher amounts of vitamin D in them. So if you're eating mushrooms and they're not exposed to ultraviolet light, you won't really be getting any vitamin D from them, because I would suggest that they are most likely to be cultivated mushrooms, and studies have looked at the amounts of vitamin D in cultivated mushrooms, and they're very, very, very low, to the point where you can almost say that it's nil. So unless you eat irradiated mushrooms, you're not going to be getting a good source of vitamin D from mushrooms, so you would have to irradiate them. You might be able to find a supplier that already that does irradiate them. Clearly this study that I looked at found a supplier that did that, and I assume that the reason they did that was to market them as high vitamin D mushrooms. But obviously the best way to do it is to do it yourself. The Indian gentleman in the case study used a lamp that he got from a hardware store. Obviously you need to be careful with that, because UV light can be dangerous, so all the caveats for that would I'm not recommending you do that. That would need to be done under controlled conditions. UV light can be dangerous. You need to take precautions if you use it. You could use the sun, and you could slice and dice the mushrooms in order to be able to increase the surface area, and I think that would have an effect as well. And it appears to be about an hour of exposure for the mushrooms in UVA light, which would be available in the sun, would generate significant amounts of vitamin D that would, based on the case study and based on other studies, they would significantly boost your vitamin D levels. If you could store that vitamin D and use it sporadically throughout the winter, I think that in the absence of supplements would likely keep your vitamin D levels in the safe range. However, I'm still saying I think the best way to take vitamin D is through a supplement, because you know how much you're getting, it's reliable, it's consistent, and it's really much more convenient and less time consuming than irradiating mushrooms. But this is just a video to show that it could be done, and some people might be interested in doing that. One thing to say about the vitamin D from mushrooms, and this is another caveat that I just want to end on, the vitamin D2 from mushrooms is hydroxylated in the liver, and it produces 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D2. If you take in lots of ergocalciferol, vitamin D2, and your levels of 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D2 increase, it appears that pushes down your 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D3 levels. There have been some studies that have looked at the plasma levels of 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D2 in people who have been taking ergocalciferol, including mushrooms, and what happens is their 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D2 levels increase, but they actually have a decrease in their 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D3 levels. So it appears there is some antagonism between the two types of vitamin D, and if you over consume your ergocalciferol, you may well actually push down your cholecalciferol. Now, if you have if you are replete with vitamin D and have very high levels and you're going in the sun, that may not make a difference. But if you're borderline insufficient or borderline deficient, I do think you have to be careful. You don't want to have unintended consequences from taking too much ergocalciferol. Again, it's not fully understood how this interaction occurs and what happens and what the long-term implications are. But I just wanted to throw that out there to say that studies have been done and there is antagonism between the two types of vitamin D. Clearly, we are designed to have cholecalciferol in our blood. We're designed to have 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D3. That's the form that we produce naturally in our skin, and it is more bioavailable in humans, which indicates it is the preferred choice by the cells. Ergocalciferol is a form of vitamin D that does appear to have all of the biological functions of cholecalciferol, but it's not so biologically active, and it does appear to have this antagonistic effect. And it's not fully understood how they interact, so that's another caveat that you do need to be aware of. And again, it's another reason why I would recommend taking vitamin D3 supplements over irradiated mushrooms. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope there was some information in there that will encourage you to look after your diet. I'm not saying that what I've said is gospel. It's my opinion. It's my interpretation of the literature. I'm going to put some links to the studies below, so you can have a look for yourself and make up your own mind. However you get your vitamin D, I think it's clear that we do need a source of vitamin D in the winter. Our levels do drop. So whether you choose, to try and get your vitamin D from food, or you try and use supplements, it is still important to make sure that those levels of vitamin D don't drop below that critical level, so you fall into an insufficiency or a deficiency. So I hope you found that interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself. And I will see you soon for another video. Take care.